Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Honda EU2000i. This machine comes to us from a subscriber, Justin, from South Carolina. He was given this by a friend who did disclose to him that it runs, it makes power, but it burns oil. And he was right. According to Justin, this machine does run, although it's down on power. And when you put a load on it, it smokes pretty bad. So he sent it to us hoping that we could get to the bottom of the issue and make it better. So that is the plan today. Now, before digging in on this, I do want to validate kind of where we're starting at. So, the oil was drained for shipping. I'm going to add some oil back. We'll add some fuel to the tank. We'll get it started and just see exactly what it's doing. And one thing I'm noticing right away here is that the exact model number was on this sticker and it's been washed off. So yeah, I'm not sure if that information is anywhere else on the machine. And assuming we're going to need parts here, we kind of need to know that number. Otherwise, we might get the wrong parts. Anyway, I can tell that this is an older model just based on the fuel cap. They swapped out the design at one point, and actually the newer design rattles pretty bad. So I do prefer the old cap, so that will give us a clue, as far as what we need to order. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here because for all I know, this engine's fine. There are a few reasons besides bad rings or a bad cylinder that would cause an engine to smoke. And one of them being a pinched or clogged breather. So that is something we will check before digging in too deep. But for now, we'll just get some oil in and try to start it. This engine takes 0.42 quarts of oil, which is just about 400 milliliters. So I measured it out. We'll try not to make too much of a mess. Perfect. And let's just take a quick look in the airbox. I know this machine actually lived most of its life on the beach. So I'm kind of surprised actually at how clean everything is. The salt in the air can usually rust things up. Justin also went through this machine very thoroughly and cleaned it. There was a fair amount of sand in here. So, of course, my initial thought is that, maybe some sand got in the engine and scored the cylinder. But he said there was a filter. So, there's no saying that there was always a filter, but there was when he got it. Anyway, this filter looks to be in great shape. Airbox is nice and clean. All right, let's give this a try. I've got you set up over here so you can see the exhaust. Now I'm going to turn the eco throttle off. The vent's already on. We'll turn the ignition on. This also has a fuel pump. It's not gravity fed, so it takes a few pulls to get it started. I already gave it 7 or 8 pulls to hopefully prime the system. So we should be just about there. We'll turn the choke on, which I assume is to the right. The label is missing, so we'll give it a few pulls. If it doesn't start, we'll flip it the other way. Oop, here we go. So yeah, I think we do have some engine issues here. You know, it was smoking, not quite as bad as I thought, but there is a very strong smell of burning oil in the air. And the engine is definitely down on horsepower. You know, with the eco switch on, I tried to pull 750 watts and it just couldn't do it. So I turned the switch off and then we could pull 750 watts, but even like that, it almost stalled a few times and the inverter cut out due to low engine speed. I did hook up the kilowatt just to make sure that the output was stable because I did see the light fluctuating. So that had me a little concerned that maybe we have more issues than just engine issues. But I think it is engine related. And I'm very tempted to get this outside and run it for a good half hour, maybe an hour, just to see if it'll burn off. But the fact that the engine is struggling tells me we are down on horsepower, that there is something wrong with this machine. So I am tempted to just open it up. But I think before we do that, let's do a few more tests, see if we can figure out exactly where the issue is. So I'm going to start by getting this panel back off. I want to open up the airbox, remove the filter, probably get the airbox off entirely. That way we can keep an eye on the breather. What I want to do is get it started again. And if we have a lot of blow-by, you know, we're going to see smoke coming out of that breather, which I think we're going to see. Interesting. We do have some mystery liquid. Looks like oil dripping. If I had to guess, it's coming from the breather. And if you look in the throat of the carb, you can see there is just a bunch of oil, and same thing with the airbox. It actually has a milky look to it, so it leads me to believe there could be some water mixed in there, which would be kind of interesting because that crankcase I thought was empty. Anyway, let's resecure the carb and get this started again, keeping an eye on the breather. So the threads, they don't go all the way down, so I'm just going to use a couple oversized nuts as spacers. And I'm guessing with the airbox disconnected that maybe the smoke might burn off. You know, if the oil is coming from the breather, then, you know, it's not going to get recirculated into the cylinder. If anything, it's just going to spray oil kind of all over the engine. So we're not going to run it too long. But I think we are going to see oil coming out of that. So I'm going to keep you right here, kind of focused in so you can see the breather. So I'm going to start the machine, you know, like before, I'll put a load on it because when under load, there is higher compression in the cylinder. So if the rings aren't doing their job, we're going to see increased blow-by when under load. So we'll start it with the eco switch off, choke on. I've seen enough. Well, that's all I needed to see. We had excessive blow-by. So the breather tube, it is not clogged. You know, when I put a 750 watt load on, I saw quite a bit of oil spraying all over everything. And there was also exhaust smoke coming out of here. So the exhaust, there's only one place it's coming from. and that is the cylinder. There is excessive blow-by past the piston, and there's only a few reasons that could happen. Either the rings are stuck, they're worn out, or the cylinder is damaged, or possibly all three. Regardless, the engine has to be opened up to make the repair. So I'm going to start peeling the layers, and before I get in too deep, I am going to do a leak down test. I want to get a baseline as far as where we're at. We'll make the repair, and then we'll do another leak down test to see if those numbers came up. I think Justin was expecting the worst. He sent along a bunch of shop towels, some gaskets, and probably most important, some Honda Bond. The crankcase, there is no seal, there is no gasket. It's actually glued together using the Honda Bond. So we are definitely going to need that. Gonna have to be careful with these bolts. They're usually on there pretty good, and given that this was used on the beach and over 20 years old, I would say, it could be an issue, although most of them are coming out. So before we go too much further, let's do that leak down test. All right, the engine's at top dead center. I'm going to apply some pressure. Now, the engine might rotate, so this could take a few tries. Although, shockingly, there is almost no leak down. So that is really interesting. We're at 100 psi in. Leak down is about 5%. So, yeah, maybe we don't have internal damage. Potentially, there's something wrong with the breather. So we do need to get these plastics off to get a look at that breather. But based on what I'm seeing here, piston and rings seem to be good. 5% leak down is actually really good. If this was a brand new engine, I don't think I could beat 5%. So from the leak down test, the engine would appear to be healthy. Of course we know otherwise. There was a ton of blow-by, and we're definitely down on power. So I guess there's a few thoughts kind of going through my mind right now. The first one being that the cylinder does have a lot of oil in it. So if the rings were stuck with that much oil in there, that could be masking the problem. Also, we could have a bad spot on the cylinder. Right now, we're at top dead center. So potentially, if the piston was in a different position, we might get significant blow-by. Also, the breather actually extends into the engine. There is a plastic tube. If that's broken, potentially that could explain some of what's going on here. So I'm thinking we need to do a little bit more investigation before going any further. I do have a borescope, which actually might not fit in there. That's a pretty small opening, but if it does, we will take a look. Otherwise, we will definitely look in the crankcase, take a look at that breather tube and see if it's damaged. All right, let's have a look. I'm going to point the camera up in the direction of the breather. We should see a plastic tube. And yeah, the tube is right there and does not appear to be damaged. So it's not the issue. Let's take a look in the cylinder. All right, let's take a look. Piston's at the bottom of its travel. And you can see the piston now. There is a lot of carbon buildup. But what little I can see of the cylinder walls actually looks pretty good. So let's switch to one of the side cameras. All right, the side camera's on. So there's an up-close look at the cylinder wall, and actually on the right side of your screen, that is the top of the head. Also a lot of carbon buildup. But the cylinder wall actually looks really good. As I was expecting to see a lot of vertical scoring, and there is some, but it's very light. And there's actually plenty of crosshatch. So I don't think the cylinder is the problem. But I am still suspicious of the rings. So let's do a quick compression test. Now this does have a decompression system, so 60 psi would be what we'd see if everything was healthy. Let's see what we get on this engine. And we're at 60 psi. So the compression test and the leak down test both say that we have a good engine. Yeah, this one, it definitely has me second guessing myself. I didn't expect it to pass the leak down test, and not only did it pass it, it passed with flying colors. Also, the compression test came out well at 60 psi, so according to those tests, we have a healthy engine. Of course, that doesn't explain why we saw oil blowing out of here and also lots of exhaust smoke. You know, the engine was definitely down on power, and really the only thing that would explain that is if combustion is blowing by the piston. So likely the rings are stuck and the test just isn't catching that problem, at least not when the engine's cold. So I'm thinking we should proceed with the teardown, and ultimately we need to get that piston out and get a closer look at what's going on. So let's get this cover off. The breather is behind here. This is the breather tube, and actually this line goes to the fuel pump. But behind here, we should see a check valve. I want to make sure that that is not damaged. Yeah, it looks to be fine. So there's no issues with the check valve and the breather system. So the rotor, it has some strong permanent magnets, so you can try to pull it out, but there's really no reason to. Now that we've broken it free from the shaft, all we need to do is rotate this a bit until we find the bolts that hold the stator on. We'll get those out, and then both the rotor and the stator should come out together. Looks like there's a pry point here on the far side. Surprisingly, the timing belt looks to be in good shape. I did find a date code on this machine. It was made in 2007. The last one I worked on was quite a bit newer, and the timing belt had a lot of cracks in it. Anyway, let's get the rockers out, and then I think we can open the crankcase. Actually, I take that back. The exhaust manifold is kind of in the way, so we will try to remove those crusty bolts to get this out of the way. All right, so we are in, and there's really not a whole lot to this. We just need to get the timing belt off so we can pull this pin. The cam comes out, or at least the gear does, and that should give us a little bit of slack to get this belt fully out. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to rotate it, make sure we're in time. And yeah, we're in time. There's a marker right here. And then On the cam, there is a line right there and another one right there. So when we put it back together, we just need to align all those marks and we should be good. Looks pretty good. And yeah, look at this. The top ring, the compression ring, the right side, it is free, but the left side, it's stuck. And actually the second ring right below it, that is the wiper ring, the oil wiper, and also the backup compression ring. That is also stuck. And that one seems to be stuck almost all the way around. Or is it broken? It's actually broken. So there's your problem. A broken number 2 ring, partially stuck number 1 ring, and the oil control ring. That one's actually free. So this is an easy fix. We just need a new set of piston rings. And I think this machine will be ready to go. I just wanted to get in here real close to show you the condition of the cylinder. It's actually very good. The borescope definitely made it look a lot worse than it was. You know, if anything, it could use a quick hone. There is a glaze in there. So that is something I usually do. You know, on an engine like this, I may not do that because the head can't be removed. And like that, if you try to hone it, one of two things might happen. Either I'm going to bottom out the hone and break the stones, or if I'm lucky enough not to do that, you know, I'm not going to be able to hone this properly because I can't really go through it like I should. So I might end up tapering the cylinder and likely not get a good crosshatch. So I might leave good enough alone in this case. I'm going to have to give that one some thought. You know, the rest of the parts are in very good shape. The crankshaft journal is practically in new condition. And the connecting rod, big end, also looks to be in good shape. So we can reuse all this stuff. We just need to get a new set of rings ordered up. And while we're at it, you know, I am going to replace the timing belt because the only way to replace that is to open the engine like we have it. So that is a good thing to do while we have the access, and we will do the oil seal as well. All right, let's start with the intake valve. These springs are pretty small, so you don't need any special tool to get them off. They're just keyed on that spring retainer. The valve stem seal is right there. We'll leave that for now until we get the new part. But with this removed, we can now pull out the valve. So I'm going to get this chucked up in a drill. We'll just use a bit of Scotch-Brite to clean this up. Okay, that one cleaned up pretty well. Let's do the other valve. And the exhaust valve, it's going to take a lot more work. There is quite a bit of carbon buildup due to all the burning of the oil. And next we're going to decarbon the head. Now to do this normally you would just take the head off and use a stainless steel wire wheel. In this case the head is not removable, so we do need to be careful of the cylinder. We don't want to cause any damage there. So Honda recommends using some cardstock, something a little bit thicker than just paper to kind of protect the cylinder. So we'll just get this installed. And then I'm going to use a stainless steel wire wheel to decarbon the head. Carbon was pretty caked up on the head. It actually took about 15 minutes to get it fully cleaned off. So I'm going to spare you guys. We'll just jump ahead and I will show you the end result. So the head cleaned up pretty well. It's not absolutely perfect. There is still a bit of carbon along the edges, but to get that, I do risk damaging the cylinder. So I'm going to leave good enough alone. As far as the cylinder itself goes, it's nearly perfect. Aside from the glaze, it could use a quick hone. I guess the concerning thing is that the service manual for this engine does not talk about honing the cylinder. It doesn't say you can't do it, but it doesn't say you can do it. And because the head is not removable, honing this may not be the best idea. I might crash the stones into the head, just breaking the hone. And, to get a good crosshatch, I think it's going to be a little bit challenging. That said, though, we are putting new rings on, so I think I should do just a really quick hone to try to break that glaze up just a bit. And one thing to double check here is just to make sure that this is magnetic. If it wasn't, then that means the cylinder is not sleeved and it's likely coated in nickel cell. In this case, it should be safe to hone. It didn't take much, just a really quick hone, and now the glaze is gone, and the cylinder looks absolutely perfect. So it is ready for the new set of rings once they arrive. So really the only thing left to do here is just to get this old sealant off. So let's take care of that. Then we can move on and clean up the piston. So I'm just using the razor blade to get off the big chunks, and then we'll use a plastic bristle brush to clean up the rest. Now the interesting thing here too is that this sealant is black, and I'm pretty sure a Honda Bond is gray. So potentially someone's been in here before. I'm not sure. The block cleaned up pretty well, and at this point it is ready as soon as we get the parts. You know, all the old sealant has been removed. It's been washed thoroughly with soap and water, and everything that needs oil has been re-oiled. You know, as far as the valves go, you know, we saw earlier that the leak down was very low, and the valves, they were sealing perfectly. So lapping those in is not going to improve anything. So I'm going to leave good enough alone. So that just leaves us with the piston, which we will clean up in a minute. And although the carb was running the engine well, I think we should at least drop the bowl and have a look and just make sure it's clean inside. And yeah, that is pretty much spotless. So the carb, for once, don't think it needs to be cleaned. All right, let's see if we can free this top ring. And it looks like it is free now. So it was not very stuck. We get the oil control rings out. There's 2 of them on the bottom. And we also have the oil expander. So this top ringland, it is very tight. So we're going to have to clean this up really well. And I'm starting to think maybe I should actually just get a new piston. They're only about $30. You know, my concern is that if these ringlands can't be cleaned properly, that we could stick one of the new rings. So let's get this in the vise. We'll clean the top surface anyway, and we'll see what we can do about this and make a decision. I've been cleaning out these ring lands for a while, and they're fairly clean, but the rings, they're not fitting much better, if at all. You know, this is the broken number 2 ring, and it's actually still pretty tight. I can lift the piston up by the ring, which is not good. And the number 1 ring, that was the one that was partially stuck. Even after cleaning this out, it still gets stuck. And, you know, it hasn't improved at all with cleaning. So, yeah, maybe the engine was rebuilt and the wrong rings were used, and that's why, you know, we ended up in the situation that we did. Or potentially the piston just has a lot of buildup, which it definitely did. So I am leaning towards probably getting a new piston. We don't want a repeat of what happened this time around. All right, it's been just over a week and we have a few parts. Most importantly, we do have a new piston, new set of rings, and some oil seals and a new timing belt. So let's start with the piston and rings. We do need to check the end gaps, but I think even before we do that, I'm kind of curious if these rings fit any better on the new piston. So we get the new piston out. And let's check the number 1 ring. Yeah, it fits in there well, no binding. And the number 2 ring, actually a very tight fit. So it shouldn't be like that. So yeah, definitely kind of suspicious of this number 2 ring. This is the one that broke and it doesn't fit even in the new piston. So either the ring was damaged, or I would say someone did rebuild this and maybe used the wrong set of rings. Anyway, let's get the new set out. And I'm going to measure the thickness of the rings. See if there's a difference. All right, let's start with the number 2 ring, the old one. And that comes in at 0.047 inches. And the new one, 0.046. So the new ring is actually 1/1000th thinner, which doesn't sound like a lot, but apparently it is, because the old one does not fit properly. The new number 1 ring, 0.0385. And the old one, 0.0380. So, yeah, the new one seems like it's 0.5 thicker. Let's just double check that. And no, actually, they're the same. So, yeah, for whatever reason, this old number 2 ring, it was 1/1000th too wide. It's a very tight gap to get in here, but I'm going to start with the 6/1000 feeler gauge. That is the minimum ring gap that we need, according to Honda. And yeah, 6 does fit. Let's go up a little and try an 8. Yep, 8 fits. Feels pretty tight. All the way up to 12/1000 is kind of standard size. So right now we're at 8. Let's try a 9. And no, 9 does not fit. So I'm going to check that in a couple spots just to make sure that gap doesn't close up. Yeah, 7/1000 fits. Let's try an 8. And yeah, so the ring gap looks good, at least on the number 1 ring. So I'm going to get that out. We'll double check the number 2. And there is a different spec for the number 2 ring. The minimum gap on this one is 12/1000 of an inch. All the way up to 18/1000 is standard size. And I can tell by looking at it, the gap is a little bigger. So we'll start with the 12/1000. Yeah, it fits, but it is tight. So I don't think it's going to be any bigger than that. But let's try a 13. Actually, 13 does fit. And so does a 14. And the 15/1000 does not fit, so we are in spec. Let's just check it further to the top. And the 14's tight. Let's try the 13. And the 13 fits. So we're in spec. The actual oil rings don't have a spec, but I will double check them. So I'm going to pause it for now. Assuming those are good, we will proceed. So the end gaps, they are good on all the rings, and they're actually on the tight side of the spec. So the bore has minimal wear, which I kind of knew because it cleaned up really fast with a quick hone. And you would also see a ring ridge if there was a problem with wear. Honda does allow, I think, up to 6/1000 of wear, and I would say we're nowhere near that. Anyway, it's an important check to check the end gap, because if you don't, and the end gap is too tight, that gap will close up when the engine heats up. And what's going to happen is that the rings are going to push really hard on the cylinder wall and likely damage it, and it'll break a ring. In this case, I don't think that's why the number 2 ring broke. It just seems like it was too tight. And I guess before I take this off, we need to take note of the orientation here. So the writing, when it's in this position, the rod says pound 3-A, and it says the same on the other side, but there is almost like a do not enter symbol. So we want this side of the rod to be on the same side as the writing. Okay, we got one circlip in, so we'll put some assembly lube on the wrist pin. We'll get that and the connecting rod in, and then get the other circlip installed. So we'll get the wrist pin started, then we'll check our orientation so the writing is facing down. We want the connecting rod to be like that, not like that. And we'll slide the wrist pin in and get the circlip installed on this side. And make sure it's in the groove. I think we're good. All right, I'm going to start with the expander ring. This goes on the bottom, and the bottom is actually made up of 3 rings. So, I stagger the gaps by about 20 degrees. Make sure you also don't overlap the expander. All right, so that is good. And then we have a control ring on the bottom and one on the top of the expander. And usually I have to do this a couple times because, the bottom ring has to move freely, or I should say rings. And if you don't put them on exactly right, you don't get free movement. And that's important. You don't want the ring binding up. It should be able to move freely in the groove. So far we're looking good. Things move, not binding up. And this control ring goes on top of the expander. Like that. And everything moves like it should. So that is good. So next we'll do the number 2 ring. Make sure the writing is up. So it should be installed like this. And the first ring, or the number 2 ring, I'm going to put the gap to the left by the writing. And the number 1 ring, I'm going to do 180 degrees, the opposite side. All right, that one's good. And number 1 ring, writing facing up. And there we go. All the rings move, nothing's binding. So the piston's good, but we're not going to install it yet. I do need to install the new oil seal, as well as a few others, and then we can proceed with the installation. Let's start with the oil seal. We'll just try to drive it out. Like that. And we have to flip it over to drive the new seal in, but we do have to be careful of that plastic tube. So I'm going to use some wood, we'll block it, and just try to keep this from breaking. And we're going to have to be careful with the seal because there is nothing stopping it from just being driven all the way through. But we do want to drive it right down to the bottom, but no further. Yeah, seal looks pretty good. Driven in nice and even right to the edge of the surface here. So the oil seal is done. Let's take care of that valve stem seal next. Next, we'll get the valves back in, starting with the intake. So next we can get the piston installed. The cylinder, it's already been oiled. So we're just going to make sure we have some oil on the rings as well as the skirt. And we'll just work that in. And take note again of which way you install this. In this case, we want the do not enter symbol kind of facing up. And the connecting rod, you can see it's not the same on both sides. You want the side that has this extra reach facing the tube. Now this is tapered, so you should be able to install this without a ring compressor, a lot like a two-stroke, but you do need to take care and help the rings get started. And don't force it. It should go in easily. If it doesn't, then you're hung up on a ring. And right now we are hung up on one of the oil control rings. There we go. And next we'll get the crankshaft in. So I'm going to put a little assembly lube here on the big end of the rod, as well as the new oil seal. And just take note too, technically you could install this cap either way, but if you do it the wrong way, the oil dipper is going to strike something. So you need to put it the correct way, which is actually indicated by a mark right there. And there is a corresponding mark, which you can't see, but it's on the big end of the connecting rod. So you want to make sure those marks align. We'll put these bolts in, and they only get torqued to 43 inch-pounds. I'm going to bring it up halfway, and then we'll finish it off at 43. And that's it. So next we'll get the camshaft back in, as well as the new timing belt. But first I'm going to put a new O-ring on this pin here. This is what holds the camshaft in place. And this little O-ring, it's just an oil seal. So, it wasn't leaking before, but since we're in there, we'll get the new seal or the new O-ring installed. So we're just rotating the crank until the timing mark right there aligns with that mark. So like that, we are at top dead center. And we can get the belt in, making sure that the word Honda is upside down. So we'll get that in place. And actually, we'll get the camshaft gear in first. And then we'll drop the belt onto the crank. Looks like we're off a tooth. All right, that is good. Yeah, it's a good thing we swapped out the belt. Although the old one wasn't cracked, it was pretty loose. And there is no belt tensioner. So this new belt, it is a much tighter fit. And just to double check on the timing, you can see that mark right there is aligned with the mark right here at the bottom of the cylinder. And if we look at the camshaft gear, you can see there is a line right there, which is parallel to that surface. And the other line is right there, also parallel to the surface. So we are, in fact, in time. Crankcase bolts get torqued to about 100 inch-pounds. So I'm going to bring it up halfway first. So we get the valves back in and check the clearance. And this is a really unique design too. There's only one lobe on the camshaft that operates both of these valves. Okay, good. The engine rotates without issue. There's no interference, which there shouldn't be, but if things are timed wrong, there could be. And we're at top dead center. We do have clearance on both valves. Let's just double check where we're at. So we'll start with the intake. Honda calls for 0.006 of an inch. And the 6 almost goes. It's pretty tight. But the spec is plus or minus 1/1000th. So the 5 fits, but it is really tight. So I think I will open that up a bit. Let's check the exhaust. It should be 0.008 of an inch. Plus or minus 1/1000th. And an 8 feels pretty good. Let's just double check with a 9. And a 9 doesn't fit. So the exhaust is perfect. The intake, we need to open it just a bit. Six actually is a bit loose. Seven's pretty good. And 8's pretty good. Yeah, we have to adjust that again. Six fits, but it's tight. 7 does not fit. Let's see if a 5 will fit in there. Yeah, and a 5 fits in there quite loose. So I think we're good now. The valves are set to 6 and 8. So let's get some Honda Bond on this surface, and we'll get the valve cover installed. And the spark arrestor was pretty clean on this machine. You know, I did brush it just to get some of the loose carbon off, but it was not clogged really. And considering how much oil it was burning, kind of surprised actually. You know, I would expect it to be a little bit more clogged up. All right, so we need to get this stuff reconnected and do it in such a way that it's somewhat orderly. This wire is for the ignition switch, so we'll come back to that. Let's see, we got a black wire here, which goes right there. That is likely to kill spark. And this wire goes up here. Might tuck it under the black wire. Yeah, and that's more or less it. We just have a ground wire left. We do have one more thing to plug in, which is actually the servo for the carburetor. So we'll do that in a bit once we get the carb bolted on. So it's the moment of truth. We've got oil, we've got fuel. This machine should be back together enough to give it a quick test. That said, though, the fuel system, it is completely dry, so it's going to take a good number of pulls to prime the system and fill the bowl. But after about 10 pulls or so, this should start. And this time I'm hoping for a different result. We'll keep a close eye on the breather, make sure we don't see any oil or smoke coming out of it. And I'm going to turn the eco switch on like last time and try to power a 750 watt load, which it couldn't do. There just wasn't enough horsepower. So let's give it a few pulls and see what we get. All right, the eco switch is off, vent is on, choke is on, and ignition, I believe, is on. Oh, kicked. It always comes down to the carb. And I didn't clean it because it was running the engine well before we did the rebuild. Of course, now that the engine's fixed, we have higher compression and likely we have different fuel requirements. And it's just highlighting the fact that we do in fact have carb issues. So we will pull that off in a minute and clean it up. But I'm thinking, let's try to restart it. We'll leave the choke on partially and then try applying the load. Yeah, I think we need to get this outside. There is a lot of oil in the exhaust that is burning off, but I think it will clear up given 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to get this outside. I've seen what I need to see. The engine seems to have plenty of power, and there is no more blow-by. So let's get this outside. We'll run it a bit until the smoke clears. All right, I think we're looking pretty good here. Initially, when I started it, there wasn't a lot of smoke. I put 750 watts on, and we did burn some oil out of the exhaust. Nothing like we saw inside, so after about 15 minutes, that smoke had completely cleared. So I bumped the load up to 1500 watts, and we had another round of smoke, and after a few minutes, that cleared up as well. So at this point, I think it's safe to get it inside and finish it up. So to get this carb cleaned up, we're going to have to remove the servo. And I'm going to start just by disconnecting the wire. So this cap comes off and there's a plug right underneath. We can unplug the wire and we'll take the whole carb off with the servo in one piece, and then we'll remove it from the carburetor. And I'm going to correct these bolts loose while it's still attached. I'm not going to remove it though, because there is a spring in there that will launch and go off into oblivion. So we'll do that in a controlled manner once we have this on the bench. Okay, and now it's just like a normal carb, so let's get the bowl off. Bowl looks pretty clean. And the carb looks pretty clean. So yeah, no surprises here, other than it's not running it quite right. Now, I was running it without the airbox, so that will definitely help richen things up. But I don't think that's going to fix it completely. So, the carb, I would say, hasn't been cleaned in a while, just judging by kind of all the dirt on the outside. So, a good clean should take care of this problem. And this is the pilot jet right here. It's just a press fit. And the main jet and the emulsion tube are down the center. So let's see if those will come out. Yep. Okay. And that's it. So I'm going to run through all the passages, just make sure they're clear, and then we'll soak this for 5 or 10 minutes in the ultrasonic. So the main jet, it is not clogged, but it is a tiny jet. I only see a little sliver of light going through it. So it wouldn't take much to clog it up, but in this case, I don't think there was anything in there creating a problem. The pilot, that one's nearly impossible to tell if it's clogged. And yeah, it's not clogged. This is going right through. Though it is a little gummy, so that could have been it. The pilot jet is what keeps the engine running when there's no load on it, but it always supplies fuel. So if it's not delivering fuel, it's going to have problems at low speed or under load. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So no smoking gun as far as why it wasn't running well. So I am cautiously optimistic that the ultrasonic will bring it back to good form. So yeah, let's get it soaking. We'll bolt it back on and try it out. Carb cleaned up pretty well, at least on the outside. The inside didn't look that bad. But with any luck, the ultrasonic found whatever the issue was and cleaned it out. So we'll get it back together, starting with the main jet. And make sure this goes all the way down, or else it'll be a vacuum leak and it will run lean. So right there, it clicked in. We're all the way down, and the idle set screw on this machine isn't set or isn't used to set the idle. It's only used to hold the pilot jet in, so only turn it until you see a thread or two poke through, which is right there. And then we need to install the servo. So we'll get the spring back in place. Hopefully without losing it. Okay, like that. And according to Honda, this should be in wide open throttle when the machine is off. So we'll get the servo installed, and depending upon the position, we might have to rotate that throttle plate until it's open. Okay, and it is wide open throttle. So just get these last two screws in place, and then, just bolt it back on the machine. And we'll try it again without the air filter, see if it's any better. All right, let's give this a try. The carb has been reinstalled, and I've already given the engine a few pulls. So the fuel, it is primed. I'm sure we're going to need to pull it a few more times before it'll start. But this time, I'm hoping I can turn the choke off all the way without it stalling. Okay, that was a pretty big improvement. This time I turned the choke off and the engine didn't stall. So it is running better, but still not perfect. I could hear it missing a little bit. It was a little bit unstable. So I'm thinking, let's get the airbox on. We'll start it one more time and see if that makes any difference. That was a noticeable improvement. It started first pull, could turn the choke off right away. The engine sounded pretty good, but just to be sure, I applied a 750 watt load with the eco switch on. The engine, it was able to throttle up and handle that load. So then I doubled it to 1500 watts. And once again, it had no issues handling the load. So the carb issue, I think, is sorted. So let's get the plastics on and finish this up. So we're all back together, but before I call this thing done, I did pick up a few new stickers. Not all of them, but some of them. I guess the only one I didn't really consider was this one right here, the safety label. It was about $30 for that sticker. So instead I got the Honda sticker for each side, as well as the missing choke label. So we'll get that stuff installed. We'll probably get that sticker removed since it doesn't have any information on it. Now, actually, earlier in the video, I did allude to the fact that this has the model number on it. So you really need that to get the right parts. And that was another reason, actually, why I wanted to get the piston and rings. They were ordered from the same diagram, so I knew they went together. On this side of the machine, I did find another sticker which had kind of the series number as well as a serial number. So this did eliminate a bunch of possibilities, from hundreds down to about 5. So I picked one of those diagrams, ordered the parts I needed, and thankfully it worked out. So yeah, let's get the old stickers off and get the new in its place. So before I put the stickers on, I'm going to use a bit of this to just get rid of any adhesive with a magic eraser. It also does a good job cleaning the plastics. And then, I'm going to degrease this and dry it real good before we get the new sticker on. So I think that guy goes something like that. We'll try to get it straight. Perfect. It's kind of crazy how just a couple stickers can really renew or refresh this machine. Clearly this machine has seen some use over its years, and now it's looking pretty good. Not to mention it's running quite well. We know it can pull 1500 watts now. I have no doubt it can pull 1600. So Let's make it official. We'll get it outside. We will do the proper load test and double check the power quality. Well, I think we're pretty much ready to go. It is bright and early on a very cold morning. It's actually below freezing, so it'll be interesting to see how this generator handles the cold. You know, I've tested several of these in this type of weather, and they start easy, but the low oil system usually kicks in and shuts the engine down several times before it'll stay running. So it'll be interesting to see how this one does. Anyway, assuming it starts and we can keep it going, we will double check the output without a load using the kilowatt, and we'll check the power quality using the amp probe. If everything looks good, we'll bring it up to a half load, do the same checks, and then eventually we'll bring it to a full load. You know, the space heater on high is 1500 watts, and once you factor in that light, that brings us to the 1600 running watts that this is rated for. So let's get it started, see how it does. I thought we had it there for a second, but the low oil sensor did kick in and shut the machine down. So yeah, we might have to do this a few times, but it should hopefully stay running with a few more starts. Well, it took quite a few tries, but we did finally get it running. I think the key was actually turning the eco throttle on. So with the engine running slower, it's not flinging quite as much oil, and it was just enough to keep it running. And now that we're building heat, we shouldn't have a problem under load. At least that's my hope. Anyway, without a load, we are starting pretty low at 0.8% THD, which is very good. You know, that will come up a little, but likely stay well under 2%. And the sine wave, very hard to see in the sun, so I'll take screenshots and put it up on your screen, but it looks absolutely perfect. So let's try a half load, 750 watts, and hopefully the machine doesn't decide to shut down. So far so good, no issues at half load, 750 watts. THD is unchanged. We're at 0.8%, so same as we saw with no load, and the sine wave looks identical, absolutely perfect. So we'll give that a few minutes, let the heat build a bit, and then we'll go for the max load of 1600 watts. It's pulling the full load without any issue. You know, I left the eco switch on just to see if it could throttle up, if it had enough horsepower, and it did so without issue. You know, as far as the smoking goes, it seems to be gone, although I can still smell a little bit of oil in that exhaust, so likely it does need a little bit more runtime before it fully burns off, but I think it will. It's running quite well. You know, as far as the power quality goes, it is excellent. THD is unchanged, 0.8%. That is top notch. And the sine wave, it's also perfect. So we'll give that a few minutes. Assuming everything goes well, we'll take the load off, let the engine cool down, then we'll shut it down. That's been running without issue for 15 minutes. And I can still smell the oil burning off, but I don't think we have an issue here. It just needs some more runtime to bake that fully out of the exhaust system. So I think I've seen enough. So I'm going to shut it down, and we'll give the engine a second to cool down, and we'll shut it down. Well, guys, I think that's pretty much it. You know, I've taken this machine as far as I can. Going into it, I was kind of expecting the worst and was actually pleasantly surprised at what I saw in the engine. You know, everything looked to be in pretty good shape, the big exception being those rings. You know, for whatever reason, they did not fit on that piston properly, and that's what led to this machine's problems. Thankfully, that was an easy fix, just a new set of rings and a matching piston. And we're back in business. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.